The forest ranger found it on the 12th day, a red vinyl lunchbox wedged between two ponderosa pine roots, partially buried in fallen needles, the metal clasp still fastened, as if the child who carried it had simply set it down to tie his shoe and never stood back up. September in Flagstaff carried the scent of change. The high desert mornings arrived cold and sharp, breath visible in the air, while afternoons burned with the last defiant heat of summer. In the small house on Cherry Avenue, 7 blocks from Sechrist Elementary School, Christine Harlow woke each morning to the sound of her husband's truck starting in the driveway, a diesel rumble that shook the bedroom window at exactly 5:47 a.m. By 6:15, she would be in the kitchen, the linoleum floor cold against her bare feet, filling the percolator with water that ran rust-colored for the first few seconds before clearing. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, filling the small kitchen with a bitter, familiar warmth. She would stand at the counter in her bathrobe, looking out the window at the neighbor's chain-link fence, at the elm tree losing its leaves one by one, at the ordinary geometry of a Thursday morning that looked like every other. Michael, they called him Mickey, was 6 years old, and in the 1st grade. He slept in the smaller bedroom at the back of the house, the one that faced the alley, where stray cats fought in the early hours and garbage trucks made their clattering rounds on Wednesdays. His room smelled like crayons and the pine-scented cleaner Christine used on the hardwood floors. Posters of dinosaurs covered one wall, a T-Rex mid-roar, a brachiosaurus stretching its long neck toward a prehistoric sky. On his dresser sat a collection of matchbox cars arranged in careful rows, organized by color, a system only Mickey understood. That Thursday morning, September 17th, 1992, Christine opened his door at 6:45. The room was still dark, curtains drawn against the dawn. She could hear his breathing, soft and steady, the sound of a child deep in whatever dream children have before the world teaches them to worry. She touched his shoulder through the blankets, her voice soft, pulling him gently from sleep. He stirred, made a small sound of protest, burrowed deeper into the pillow. When she opened the curtains, grey light spilled in. The sky over Flagstaff hung low and heavy with clouds that hadn't yet decided whether to release rain or simply brood all day. Mickey sat up slowly, his brown hair sticking up in the back, his eyes still half closed. He wore Superman pajamas, a size too big, hand-me-downs from his cousin in Phoenix. Christine made him wash his face and brush his teeth. She could hear him in the bathroom, the water running, the sound of the toothbrush tapping against the sink. When he emerged, she had his clothes laid out on his bed. Jeans, a green and white striped shirt, white socks with green bands at the top, his sneakers with the Velcro straps because he still struggled with laces. He dressed himself slowly, with the dawdling distraction of a 6-year-old. He stopped to look at his dinosaur posters. He reorganized 3 of his matchbox cars. He found a small plastic soldier under his bed and spent 30 seconds making it climb the bedpost. She had made oatmeal with brown sugar and a handful of raisins, the way he liked it. A glass of orange juice sat beside the bowl, and she'd put out the vitamins. 1 Flintstones chewable, Dino the dinosaur, purple and vaguely grape-flavored. Mickey ate slowly, methodically, pushing the raisins to one side of the bowl before eating them one at a time. The kitchen radio played softly. Morning news, weather, traffic reports for a town too small to have real traffic. The weatherman predicted possible showers in the afternoon. Temperatures in the low 60s. Christine moved around the kitchen, packing his lunch. A peanut butter and jelly sandwich on wheat bread, cut diagonally the way he insisted. A small bag of pretzels. A juice box. An oatmeal cookie wrapped in wax paper. She placed everything carefully in his lunchbox. Red vinyl with a faded Transformers logo, bought at a yard sale the previous summer for 50 cents. Robert, her husband, had left for the construction site without saying much, as was his way. He worked long hours framing houses in the new development north of town, coming home each evening covered in sawdust, smelling of wood and sweat and the menthol cigarettes he smoked during breaks. He was a quiet man, steady, someone who expressed love through labor rather than words. Before he left that morning, he'd ruffled Mickey's hair and told him to be good at school. At 7:30, Christine helped Mickey into his jacket, a blue windbreaker with a small tear in the left pocket that she kept meaning to sew. She zipped it up to his chin, smoothed down his collar, adjusted the backpack on his shoulders. It was a small pack, dark blue, containing a folder of homework, a library book about sharks, and a pencil case shaped like a school bus. She knelt down to his level, tucking a stray piece of hair behind his ear. His face was so small, so serious. He had her eyes, brown and wide-set, and his father's stubborn chin. A spray of freckles crossed his nose, summer ghosts fading as autumn advanced. She reminded him to be good, to listen to his teacher, to walk straight home after school, no stopping at the park. He nodded with the patient tolerance of a child accustomed to these daily warnings. She kissed his forehead. He smelled like children's shampoo and oatmeal and something else, something uniquely him, a scent she would later find impossible to describe, but would search for desperately in his empty room, in his unwashed clothes, in the pillowcase she couldn't bring herself to change. She walked him to the door. The morning was cool and grey, the street quiet except for a dog barking 3 houses down. Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly neighbour, was already on her porch, watering her geraniums with a green watering can. She waved at Mickey. He waved back. Christine stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the cold, watching him walk down the sidewalk. He was small for his age, the backpack nearly as big as his torso, the lunchbox swinging slightly in his right hand. At the end of the block, he would turn left onto Pine Street, walk 4 more blocks past the auto repair shop and the corner store, then cross at the light where the crossing guard, Mrs. Chen, who had been doing this job for 15 years, would be waiting. The walk to school took 12 minutes if he didn't dawdle. Mickey liked to dawdle. He reached the corner and Christine waited, expecting him to turn and wave the way he sometimes did, the way he had done just yesterday and the day before that. But this morning, he didn't turn. He simply rounded the corner and disappeared from view, the blue of his windbreaker blending into the grey morning until there was nothing left but the empty street and the sound of Mrs. Kowalski's watering can spattering against terracotta. Christine went back inside. She closed the door. She poured herself another cup of coffee. She had 4 hours before she needed to leave for her shift at the hospital cafeteria. 4 hours to clean the kitchen, start a load of laundry, maybe watch one of her shows if there was time. She did not know, could not have known, that she would never see her son walk down that sidewalk again, that the last image of him, the blue windbreaker disappearing around the corner, would become the image she replayed endlessly, obsessively, searching for some sign she had missed, some premonition she should have felt, some maternal instinct that should have made her call him back, keep him home, hold him safe. But there was nothing, just a Thursday morning, just a child going to school, just the ordinary violence of time moving forward into disaster. School ended at 2:45 p.m. Christine finished her shift at the hospital at 2 o'clock. She drove home in the old Buick, windows down despite the chill, the radio playing country songs that all sounded vaguely the same. She stopped at the grocery store for milk and bread, spent 8 minutes in line behind a woman arguing about an expired coupon, arrived home at 2:32. The house was exactly as she'd left it, the coffee cup in the sink, the folded laundry on the couch, Mickey's cereal bowl, rinsed and waiting in the dish rack. She put away the groceries. She set out a snack for him, apple slices and peanut butter, his favourite. She turned on the television, a soap opera she followed loosely, the kind of program where people cried in expensive clothes about problems that seemed both urgent and weightless. At 2:57, she muted the television and went to the front window. The street was empty. She wasn't worried yet. Mickey often took his time coming home. He liked to look at things, interesting rocks, insects, the way shadows fell across the sidewalk. Once, he'd spent 20 minutes watching a line of ants carry crumbs across the driveway. Time didn't mean much to him. At 3:05, she opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. A few houses down, she could see Mr. Gonzalez washing his car. Across the street, the Petersons' cat sat on a windowsill, watching birds. Normal suburban rhythms, everything as it should be. At 3:12, a knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. She walked to the end of the driveway, looked both directions down Cherry Avenue. A few other children were walking home. Older kids, 4th and 5th graders, but no small boy in a blue windbreaker. No familiar silhouette carrying a red lunchbox. She went back inside. Maybe he'd stayed after for something. Maybe Mrs. Patterson had kept the class late. Maybe he'd gone to the bathroom and missed the initial dismissal bell. She tried to rationalize the delay. to construct innocent explanations, but the anxiety was spreading now, creeping up from her stomach into her chest, making her hands shake slightly as she picked up the phone. She dialed the school. The line rang 4 times before the secretary answered, her voice cheerful and detached. Christine asked if Mickey was still there, if he'd been kept after class for any reason. There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. Then the secretary said no, all the first graders had been dismissed on time. Mrs. Patterson had left for the day. Was there a problem? Christine said no, no problem. Thank you, and hung up. The receiver felt heavy in her hand. At 3:25, she called Robert at the construction site. The foreman had to walk across the lot to get him, and she could hear hammering and the whine of saws in the background, the sounds of men building houses for other people's children to grow up in. When Robert came on the line, his voice was concerned but still calm, still rational. Maybe Mickey had gone home with a friend. Maybe he'd stopped at the park, despite being told not to. Kids did that. Robert would drive around, check the usual places. The playground at Buffalo Park, the corner store where Mickey liked to look at the candy. He'd find him. There was nothing to worry about yet, but Christine was worrying. She was standing in the kitchen, staring at the apple slices turning brown on the plate, and something inside her had shifted. Some fundamental understanding of how the world worked. The minutes were accumulating into something heavier than time, each one adding weight to a dread she couldn't name but could feel settling into her bones. At 3:40, she walked the route to school herself, retracing the path Mickey would have taken. Past the auto repair shop where Mr. Hendricks was under a car on a creeper, his legs sticking out, grease-stained jeans and work boots. Past the corner store with its sun-faded awning and windows plastered with advertisements for cigarettes and lottery tickets. She asked the clerk, a teenager with bad skin and a name tag that said Travis, if he'd seen a small boy in a blue jacket. Travis shrugged, said he'd seen lots of kids. School just got out, you know. She walked the 4 blocks to the school. The building looked abandoned now, windows dark, the playground empty, except for a forgotten jump rope coiled like a snake near the monkey bars. She tried the front doors. Locked. She cupped her hands against the glass and peered inside at the dim hallway. The bulletin boards decorated with construction paper leaves. The water fountain with its perpetual drip. Nothing moved. No small boy hiding, waiting to surprise her. Just silence and the smell of floor wax and industrial cleaning solution seeping through the door seals. She walked around to the back of the school, where the buses lined up in the morning, where the dumpsters sat behind a chain-link fence. Empty. She called his name, her voice sounding small and strange in the open air. Mickey. Mickey, baby. If you're playing a game, it's not funny anymore. Mickey, please. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the asphalt, and no one answered. By 4 o'clock, Robert had driven through every park and playground within a 2-mile radius. He'd stopped at the homes of Mickey's classmates, the ones whose addresses he could remember, knocking on doors and asking if their children had seen him. If Mickey had said anything about going somewhere after school. The parents answered with growing concern, called their own children to the door, asked them questions. The kids shrugged, said they didn't know, said Mickey had been in class but they didn't remember seeing him leave. One little girl, Sarah Mendoza, said she thought she'd seen him at the crosswalk with Mrs. Chen, but she wasn't sure. Maybe it was yesterday she was thinking of. The days all blurred together when you were 6. Robert came home at 4:30. Christine was standing in the driveway, still wearing her work clothes, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. He got out of the truck and she saw in his face that he hadn't found anything. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that they were crossing a threshold into territory neither of them knew how to navigate. Robert said he was going to call the police. Christine nodded. They went inside. The house felt wrong now, too quiet. The spaces where Mickey should be, his backpack on the hook by the door, his shoes kicked off in the hallway, his voice calling for a snack, all achingly, impossibly empty. The police arrived at 5:17 p.m. 2 officers in a patrol car, young men who looked barely old enough to be out of high school themselves, though one had a wedding ring and the other had a coffee stain on his uniform shirt. They stood in the living room with their notepads, asking questions in voices that tried for professional calm but couldn't quite hide their uncertainty. What was Mickey wearing? Blue windbreaker, green and white striped shirt, jeans, white socks with green bands, Velcro sneakers. Did he have any identifying marks? Freckles across his nose, a small scar on his left knee from falling off his bike last summer. What time did he leave for school? 7:30 a.m. What time should he have been home? By 3:00, maybe 3:15 at the latest. Had there been any family problems, any arguments, any reason he might run away? No. No. He was 6 years old. Where would he run to? Did he have any friends in the neighborhood he was particularly close to? The Mendoza girl, Sarah, from his class. The Kellerman boy, but he lived across town. Had they noticed anyone suspicious in the neighborhood recently? Any strangers? Any unusual cars? Christine tried to think, tried to remember, but the last few weeks felt like they'd happened to someone else. Ordinary time that had seemed unremarkable until this moment when every detail might matter. There had been a cable repair van on the street last week. A man selling magazines door to door a few days ago. Were these things important? She didn't know. The officers wrote everything down with a methodical slowness that made her want to scream. They asked to see Mickey's room. Christine led them down the hallway, opened the door, and stepped back. The officers stood in the doorway, looking at the dinosaur posters, the matchbox cars, the small bed with its tangled sheets, and something in their postures changed. One of them cleared his throat. The other made a note in his pad. They asked if anything was missing. Christine looked around, trying to see the room through their eyes, trying to notice what wasn't there. His backpack was gone. He'd taken it to school. The library book about sharks was gone. His jacket was gone. But everything else looked the same. The plastic soldier he'd been playing with that morning was still on the floor beside his bed. His pajamas were folded on his pillow. She picked them up without thinking, held them against her chest, felt the soft cotton against her hands. The officers watched her. One of them said they were going to issue a bolo, be on the lookout, and start organizing a search. They would need a recent photograph. Christine went to the hallway and took down the school picture from last spring. Mickey smiling with a gap where his front tooth had been. His hair neatly combed in a way it never looked any other time. She handed it to the officer and watched him slide it into a plastic evidence bag, watched her son's face disappear behind the translucent material. By 6 o'clock, neighbors had started gathering in the street. News traveled fast in small communities, passed through phone calls and over-the-fence conversations, and soon there were 20 people, then 30, then more, standing on lawns and sidewalks, asking what they could do to help. Someone suggested organizing a search party. Someone else said they should wait for official instruction from the police, but waiting felt impossible, felt like surrender, and so people started moving, forming small groups, deciding to search the immediate area at least, the alleys and vacant lots, and undeveloped land at the edge of the neighborhood. Robert stood on the front lawn, his voice hoarse as he called out instructions, dividing the searchers into groups, assigning different areas. Christine watched from the porch, unable to move, unable to join them, because if she left the house, then Mickey might come home and find no one there, might think he'd done something wrong, might think he wasn't wanted. The search began as the sun started to set. Flashlights appeared, cutting through the gathering darkness, bobbing up and down as people walked through the scrubland behind the houses. Voices called Mickey's name, dozens of voices, creating a strange echo that bounced off the houses and trees. Mickey, Mickey Harlow. The sound was almost musical in its desperation. A chorus of people who'd lived on this street for years, who'd waved at each other from driveways, who'd borrowed tools and traded recipes and complained about property taxes, now united in this single urgent purpose. Mrs. Kowalski from next door brought Christine a cup of tea she couldn't drink. Mr. Gonzalez said he'd called his brother-in-law who worked for the county sheriff, said they'd be sending more people. The Petersons offered their phone for making additional calls. Everyone wanted to do something, to contribute, to push back against the helplessness that was settling over the street like the cold September night. The police returned with more officers and a sergeant named Frank Delacroix, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a grey moustache and eyes that had seen too many of these situations. He set up a command post in the Harlow's driveway, brought in tables and maps, started coordinating the civilian searchers with arriving deputies. He asked Christine more questions, the same questions in different words, probing for details she might have forgotten. What was Mickey's state of mind that morning? Happy? Sad? Anxious about anything? Christine tried to remember, tried to recall anything unusual in his behavior, but it had been such an ordinary morning, so completely unremarkable. He'd been sleepy, He'd reorganized his toy cars. He'd eaten his oatmeal slowly. There was nothing there. No clue, no warning. Just a child being a child on a Thursday morning that should have been like any other Thursday. Sergeant Delacroix explained the procedure. They would search in expanding circles from the house and the school. They had contacted the school district for a list of all staff and any recent terminations or disciplinary actions. They would interview the crossing guard, Mrs. Chen, and any other adults who might have seen Mickey that morning. They would check with local businesses, gas stations, convenience stores, any place someone might have stopped with a child. They would alert hospitals and clinics throughout the region. They were doing everything right, following all the protocols. But Christine could hear something in his voice, a weariness, a recognition of how these things often went. The first hours were critical. The first hours were already gone. The temperature dropped as night settled in fully. Searchers returned to the Harlow house in waves, their faces grim, shaking their heads. Nothing in the vacant lots. Nothing in the drainage ditches. Nothing in the shopping centre parking lot, or behind the gas station, or in the empty lot where teenagers sometimes parked to drink beer and smoke cigarettes. Robert went out with one group, came back, went out with another. His face was pale, his hands shaking, but he couldn't stop moving. To stop was to think, and thinking led nowhere good. Christine sat on the couch inside, surrounded by neighbour women who meant well but didn't know what to say. They brought food no one would eat. They made coffee that went cold in the pot. They patted her hand and said Mickey would turn up. Kids wandered off all the time. He probably just lost track of time. He'd be home soon, you'll see. But their voices betrayed them, growing less certain as the hours passed. At midnight, Sergeant Delacroix suspended the civilian search until morning. It was too dark, too dangerous, too easy for searchers to get hurt stumbling over rough terrain. The official search would continue. Officers with high-powered lights working in grids. But the neighbours needed to go home, get some rest, come back at first light. People left reluctantly, promising to return, touching Christine's shoulder as they passed, their hands warm and useless. By 1 a.m., only Robert and Christine remained with two officers who'd been assigned to stay at the house in case Mickey returned or someone called with information. The officers sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee, speaking in low voices. Robert sat in Mickey's room, not moving, just sitting on the edge of the small bed in the darkness. Christine stood at the front window, watching the street, waiting for movement that didn't come. The first night was the longest. Time behaved differently, stretching and contracting, minutes lasting hours, while hours disappeared in moments of dissociation, where Christine would find herself in different rooms without remembering walking there. She would be at the window, then suddenly in Mickey's doorway, watching Robert's silhouette, then back in the kitchen, staring at the apple slices she'd set out 12 hours ago, now brown and withered and inedible. She couldn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. Everything inside her felt frozen, locked behind a wall of shock that her mind had erected to protect itself from understanding what might be happening. Dawn came slowly, the sky shifting from black to grey with agonizing gradualness. At 6:15 a.m., 24 hours after Mickey had last woken up in this house, Christine heard Robert's truck start in the driveway and realized he hadn't slept, hadn't even tried. He was going back out, would drive every street in Flagstaff if necessary, would search until he found something. She wanted to tell him to rest, to eat something, to take care of himself, but the words seemed pointless. What did rest matter? What did food matter? Their child was somewhere. That was the only fact that mattered. By 7 a.m., the searchers had returned. More of them now, word having spread through churches and workplaces and schools. Someone had printed flyers overnight. Mickey's school photo reproduced in grainy black and white, his name, his description, the phone number to call. People took stacks of them, fanned out across the city, taping them to telephone poles and storefront windows and community bulletin boards. The image multiplied. Dozens, then hundreds of copies of Mickey's gap-toothed smile appearing on every corner, in every business. A face that had belonged to one family, now becoming the face that everyone knew, everyone was looking for. The police brought in search dogs on the second day, German shepherds trained to track scents, handlers walking them through Mickey's room, letting them smell his unwashed pajamas, his dirty clothes from the hamper, building a scent profile. The dogs were led to the school, to the route Mickey should have walked, and they followed something for a while, pulling their handlers down Pine Street, past the auto repair shop, past the corner store, all the way to the crossing where Mrs. Chen stood each morning with her stop sign and orange vest. Then the trail ended. The dogs circled, confused, searching for a scent that had vanished. One handler said this was common. Too many other children walking the same route. Too many scents overlapping. Too much time passed. The other handler said nothing, just looked at Christine with an expression she would come to recognize over the following days, a professional sympathy that acknowledged the worst without speaking it. Mrs. Chen was interviewed multiple times. She was 72 years old, had been a crossing guard for 15 years, knew most of the children by sight, if not by name. She remembered Thursday morning. She remembered rain threatening, but not falling. She remembered the usual crowd of children crossing between 7:30 and 8 a.m. Did she remember Mickey specifically? She thought so. A small boy in a blue jacket. Yes, she thought she'd seen him. But which day? Thursday? Or was it Wednesday? The days blurred together. So many children. So many mornings. She became increasingly distressed as the detectives pressed her. Started to cry. Said she was so sorry. She should have paid more attention. She should have noticed. But how could she have known? How could anyone have known that this one child, on this one morning, needed to be watched more carefully than all the others? The school was interviewed. Principal, teachers, janitors, cafeteria workers, everyone who'd been on campus Thursday. Mickey had been in class that morning. Mrs. Patterson confirmed it. He'd been quiet, had completed his math worksheet, had eaten lunch in the cafeteria, a corn dog and green beans, and a small carton of chocolate milk. He'd played on the playground during recess, had been seen on the swings. Several classmates remembered seeing him, but dismissal was chaos, always was. Hundreds of children flooding out of the building at once, funneling toward buses and parent pickup and the walking route home. No one specifically remembered seeing Mickey leave. No one remembered him in the crowd of children heading toward the crosswalk. He'd simply dissolved into the mass of small bodies and hadn't emerged on the other side. The media arrived on the third day. News vans from Phoenix and Albuquerque. Reporters with perfectly styled hair and serious expressions. Camera operators setting up shots of the neighborhood, of the school, of the Harlow house with its brown lawn and chain-link fence. They interviewed Sergeant Delacroix, who gave measured statements about the ongoing investigation, about the community's response, about how they were pursuing all leads. They tried to interview Christine, but Robert stood between them and the front door, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. She had nothing to say to cameras. What could she say? Please bring back my son. Please let this be a mistake. The words were too small for the howling void that was opening up inside her. On the fourth day, a psychic called the police tip line, then another, then 5 more. They had visions, they said. They could see Mickey, could sense where he was. One said he was near water. Another said he was in a basement. A third said he'd been taken by a man in a white van. The police had to follow up on every call, every lead, no matter how absurd, because what if one of them was real? What if someone actually knew something? Officers were dispatched to check ponds and creeks, to investigate basements in abandoned houses, to look for white vans, of which there were approximately 300 in the greater Flagstaff area. The tips generated more searches, more interviews, more paperwork. But no Mickey. Tips came from other sources too. People who'd seen suspicious characters, people who'd noticed unusual behavior, people who had scores to settle with neighbors and saw an opportunity to direct police attention elsewhere. A man 3 blocks over who kept to himself and had a German shepherd that barked too much. A woman who worked at the elementary school cafeteria and had been fired last year for stealing frozen chicken nuggets. A drifter who'd been seen panhandling downtown the week before. Each tip spawned an investigation, interviews, background checks, alibis verified or dismissed. The machinery of a missing child case ground forward with bureaucratic inevitability, generating reports and files and folders, but not answers. Robert stopped going to work. He spent every daylight hour searching, driving back roads and hiking trails, checking abandoned buildings and homeless camps. Anywhere a child might be hidden or might have wandered. He lost weight rapidly, his clothes hanging loose, his face becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed. He barely spoke, even to Christine. At night he would sit in Mickey's room, motionless, as if keeping vigil would somehow summon the child back. Christine tried to maintain some semblance of routine, tried to eat, tried to sleep, but her body refused. Food tasted like ash. Sleep brought nightmares more vivid than waking. She existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully present nor able to escape, trapped in the terrible waiting. On the 7th day, the story ran on national news. Mickey's face appeared on morning shows and evening broadcasts. His school photo, now familiar to millions of people who'd never heard of Flagstaff, Arizona, who'd never driven down Cherry Avenue, who'd never met a shy 6-year-old boy who liked dinosaurs and matchbox cars. The exposure generated more tips, more psychics, more well-meaning people calling to say they'd seen a child who looked like Mickey at a rest stop in Nevada, at a McDonald's in New Mexico, being led by a man through a parking lot in California. Each sighting had to be investigated, resources stretching thinner, the signal-to-noise ratio deteriorating as the case spread across a wider geographic area. The FBI became involved, agents arriving with federal resources and protocols designed for exactly these situations. They brought behavioral analysts who created profiles of potential suspects. They brought technical specialists who enhanced the school surveillance footage, grainy black and white images from cameras positioned at the building's entrances. The footage showed hundreds of children leaving school Thursday afternoon, pixelated figures too small to identify with certainty. But analysts froze frames, measured heights, tried to isolate anyone who might be Mickey. They found 3 possibilities, 3 small figures in jackets who could have been him. But the resolution was too poor to be certain, and the figures disappeared off camera within seconds, swallowed by the crowd. Polygraph tests were administered. Robert and Christine both took them voluntarily, understanding that statistically, family members were suspects in cases like this, that the police had to eliminate them before fully pursuing outside leads. The tests were conducted in a windowless room at the police station, sensors attached to their bodies. Questions asked in flat, emotionless tones. Did you harm your son? Do you know where Mickey is? Are you responsible for his disappearance? Both passed. The examiner said their responses indicated no deception, though polygraphs weren't foolproof, weren't admissible in court, were really just one tool among many, but it allowed the investigation to shift focus fully outward, to the world beyond the Harlow family, to the strangers and shadows where danger actually lurked. On the 8th day, a hiker in the Coconino National Forest, about 8 miles north of Flagstaff, found a small blue backpack hanging from a tree branch. It was weathered, partially obscured by pine needles, and the hiker almost missed it. But something about the way it dangled there, deliberately placed rather than accidentally lost, made him look closer. He called it in. Rangers arrived, secured the scene, contacted the police. The backpack was brought to the command post, placed on a table, photographed from every angle before being opened. Inside was a homework folder, slightly damp but readable. The name on the folder was Michael Harlow, written in a teacher's careful print. There was also a library book about sharks, its pages swollen from moisture, and a pencil case shaped like a school bus, but no lunchbox, no child. The discovery shifted the search focus to the forest. If Mickey's backpack had been found there, then perhaps Mickey himself was there too. Hundreds of searchers combed the area around where the backpack was discovered, moving in expanding grids, looking under fallen logs and in drainage culverts and behind boulder clusters. Search dogs were brought in again, given the backpack to smell, asked to find the trail. They picked up something, followed it for a quarter-mile through dense pine forest, then lost it at a logging road where the scent dissipated against dirt and vehicle exhaust. Someone had driven there, had possibly taken Mickey into a vehicle, had possibly driven away, or the dogs were wrong, or the backpack had been moved. The evidence suggested something, but proved nothing. Robert drove to the forest site, stood where the backpack had been found, and looked around at the endless trees, the vast indifferent wilderness that could hide a small body indefinitely. The forest stretched for hundreds of square miles in every direction, terrain so rough and dense that searchers could pass within feet of something and never see it. He stood there for 3 hours, not moving, not speaking, while search teams worked around him. Christine couldn't go, couldn't see the place where her son's belongings had been discarded like trash. She stayed home, sitting in Mickey's room, holding his pajamas, no longer trying to make sense of anything. The search intensified for 2 more days. News helicopters flew overhead, filming the forest, the search teams, the police vehicles clustered on logging roads. Volunteers came from across Arizona, experienced hikers and outdoorsmen who knew the terrain, who understood how to move through wilderness, how to spot disturbances in the landscape. They found animal bones. They found old campsites. They found trash and abandoned equipment and the detritus of decades of human presence in the forest. But they didn't find Mickey. On the morning of the 12th day, Robert was searching alone in a sector the organized teams had already covered. He'd become obsessive about rechecking areas, convinced that something had been missed, that some crucial piece of evidence was lying just out of sight. He was operating on no sleep and minimal food. His judgment compromised, but he couldn't stop. To stop was to accept, and he would never accept. He was walking through a dense stand of ponderosa pines, pushing through low branches, when he saw it, a splash of red against the brown and green of the forest floor. He stopped walking. His heart, which had been beating in a steady, exhausted rhythm for 12 days, suddenly accelerated. He moved toward the red object slowly, as if approaching something that might vanish if startled. When he got close enough to see clearly, his legs gave out. He fell to his knees in the pine needles and made a sound that was not quite human, a wail that came from somewhere deep and primal, a place where language hadn't yet been invented and grief was just pure sound. It was Mickey's lunchbox, the red vinyl Transformers lunchbox that Christine had packed 12 continua days ago, with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and pretzels and a juice box and an oatmeal cookie. It was wedged between two tree roots, partially buried in fallen needles, the metal clasp still fastened. Robert reached for it with shaking hands, picked it up, felt its weight. There was something inside. He didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what 12 days in the forest had done to the contents, but his hands moved independently of his will, thumbs pressing the clasp, lifting the lid. The food was still there, the sandwich, now green with mold, the pretzels, softened by moisture, the juice box, punctured and empty, the cookie, dissolved into a paste. But there was something else, a piece of paper, folded small, tucked into the corner of the lunchbox. Robert pulled it out with trembling fingers, unfolded it. The paper was damp, but the ink was still legible. 5 words in block letters, written with what looked like a black marker. He didn't feel any pain. Robert's scream brought searchers running. They found him on his knees, the lunchbox open beside him, the note clutched in his fist, his body convulsing with sobs that sounded like they were tearing him apart from the inside. Someone radioed for police. Someone else tried to take the note from Robert's hand, but he wouldn't let go. His fingers locked around it as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had become liquid and unstable. It took 3 men to get him to his feet, to guide him out of the forest, to load him into a vehicle for the drive back to town. The lunchbox and the note became evidence. Forensics examined them for fingerprints, for DNA, for any trace that might identify who had handled them. The note was analyzed. The paper was common, available at any office supply store. The marker was a Sharpie, black, permanent ink, one of millions sold annually. No fingerprints except Robert's on the note itself, and the lunchbox had been handled by too many people over the months since Christine bought it at a yard sale. The handwriting was deliberately disguised, block letters that revealed nothing about the writer. Linguistic analysis suggested the writer was educated, comfortable with written communication, understood the psychological impact of the message, but this narrowed the suspect pool by nothing. It could be anyone. The discovery of the lunchbox with its terrible note meant one of 2 things. Either Mickey was dead and someone wanted the family to know it, or someone wanted the family to believe he was dead for reasons unclear. The police had to pursue both possibilities. They intensified the forest search, now looking specifically for remains, bringing in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar and forensic anthropologists who understood how bodies decomposed in wilderness settings. They also continued investigating abduction scenarios, the possibility that Mickey was being held somewhere, that the note was misdirection, that someone sick enough to take a child might also be sick enough to torture his family with false messages. Christine received the news about the lunchbox while sitting in her living room surrounded by family members who'd come from out of state, her sister from Colorado, Robert's brother from California, people who didn't know what to do but couldn't stay away. When the police liaison told her what had been found, what the note said, something inside her broke in a way that was almost audible, a snapping of whatever thread had been holding her together. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stood up, walked to Mickey's room, closed the door, and didn't come out for 3 days. Robert descended into a place beyond grief, a realm of pure rage and desperation. He became convinced he could find Mickey if he just searched hard enough, long enough, looked in the right places. He spent every daylight hour in the forest, ignoring police instructions to stay away from the active crime scene, ducking around barriers, avoiding search teams, conducting his own frantic investigation. He dug in places where the ground looked disturbed. He climbed down ravines. He checked inside hollow logs and behind rock formations and anywhere a small body might be hidden. Other searchers would find him sometimes, lost and disoriented, scratched from branches and bleeding from falls, and have to guide him back to the road. Each time, he would rest for a few hours, then return. The police investigation began showing cracks. Sergeant Delacroix was overwhelmed. The case larger than anything the Flagstaff department had handled before. Resources stretched beyond capacity. Mistakes were made. Evidence was processed slowly. Witnesses were interviewed once, but not followed up with. Tips sat in voicemail boxes for days before being returned. The FBI agents tried to impose order, but jurisdictional tensions created friction. Local police resented federal intrusion. Federal agents were frustrated by what they saw as small-town incompetence. The investigation became fragmented, different teams pursuing different theories without adequate coordination. A suspect emerged on day 16. Gerald Vance, a 38-year-old maintenance worker who'd been fired from the school district 3 months earlier after complaints about his behavior around children. Nothing concrete, nothing prosecutable, just unease expressed by teachers and parents. A sense that something about him wasn't right. He watched the children too closely. He found excuses to be near the playground during recess. He asked kids questions that seemed overly personal. The district had let him go quietly. No formal charges, just a termination for performance issues that left no paper trail. Vance lived alone in a trailer on the outskirts of town. No family, no close friends. The kind of isolation that in retrospect seemed suspicious, but in practice was just the way some people live. Police obtained a warrant, searched his residence, found a collection of children's drawings he'd kept from his time working at various schools. The drawings weren't inherently sinister, stick figures and rainbows and houses with smoke curling from chimneys, but the fact that he'd saved them, had them organized in folders by school and year, suggested an unhealthy fixation. They also found newspaper clippings about Mickey's disappearance, extensive coverage cut from local and regional papers, arranged in a scrapbook with dates noted in the margin. Vance was brought in for questioning. He had an alibi for September 17th. He'd been at a dental appointment at 2:30 p.m. confirmed by the dentist's receptionist, then at a grocery store at 3:15 p.m. confirmed by a receipt found in his trailer. The timeline didn't work. He couldn't have been at the school when Mickey disappeared, but he also couldn't explain the drawings, couldn't explain why he'd been collecting newspaper articles about a missing child, couldn't explain a lot of things. Under pressure, his story changed. First he said he'd been following the case because he felt guilty, like maybe if he'd still been working at the school he might have noticed something. Then he said he was trying to solve it himself, thought he had insights the police didn't. Then he broke down completely, admitted he had a problem, had feelings about children he knew were wrong, had been trying to resist them but couldn't always, couldn't explain it, needed help. The confession created a media firestorm. Local news reported that a suspect with a history of inappropriate behavior toward children had confessed to having a problem, which the public immediately interpreted as a confession to taking Mickey. Protests formed outside the police station. Parents from the school district demanded answers. Robert showed up with a tire iron, had to be restrained by 4 officers, was arrested for assault and disorderly conduct before being released with a warning. The pressure on police to charge Vance became enormous. Political and emotional pressure that made careful investigation nearly impossible, but the evidence didn't support charges. Vance's alibi held. His trailer had been searched thoroughly. No trace of Mickey, no children's clothing, no physical evidence connecting him to the crime. The drawings and newspaper clippings suggested obsession, but not action. Psychological evaluation indicated he had pedophilic tendencies, but no history of violent behavior, no escalation pattern that would predict abduction. The note found in the lunchbox didn't match his handwriting, and handwriting analysis suggested it hadn't been deliberately disguised to the extent that would fool forensic examination. After 72 hours, Vance was released. Charges were not filed. The district attorney gave a press conference explaining the decision, talking about burden of proof and admissible evidence, and the difference between suspicion and conviction. The crowd that had gathered outside the courthouse booed. Vance left Flagstaff 3 days after his release, driven out by threats and vandalism. His trailer spray-painted with obscenities, his vehicle keyed, his mailbox smashed with a baseball bat. He moved to another state, changed his name, disappeared into whatever life someone like that could build. Years later, investigators would occasionally revisit his case, wondering if they'd missed something, if the alibi had been fabricated, if he'd had an accomplice, but nothing new ever emerged. He remained a tantalizing possibility that led nowhere. With Vance eliminated, the investigation lost momentum. Leads dried up. The daily search operations were scaled back, then suspended, then officially ended. Police assured the family that the case remained active, that detectives were still working it, but the resources dedicated to it diminished. Officers were reassigned. The command post in the Harlow driveway was dismantled. The maps and charts and timelines were boxed up and stored in the department's evidence room. Life, or something approximating it, was supposed to resume, but life didn't resume. Not for Christine and Robert, not for the neighborhood, not for the city. Something fundamental had changed. Parents who'd previously let their children walk to school alone now drove them. Playgrounds that had been full of unsupervised kids became empty unless adults were present. People started locking doors they'd never locked before, installing security lights, buying dogs for protection rather than companionship. The sense of safety that had characterized Flagstaff, the small-town trust that let neighbors leave their homes unlocked and children roam freely, evaporated. In its place grew suspicion, paranoia, a low-grade fear that never fully dissipated. The Harlow house became a monument to absence. Christine stopped working, stopped leaving except for necessary errands, stopped engaging with the world. She kept Mickey's room exactly as it had been. His clothes in the drawers, his toys on the shelves, his bed made with the same sheets he'd slept in that last night. Visitors found the preservation disturbing, like a shrine to someone who might still walk through the door, but Christine couldn't change it. To change it would be to accept he wasn't coming back, and acceptance meant death, meant letting go of the only thing keeping her tethered to sanity. Robert aged a decade in a single year. His hair turned grey. His face developed deep lines that hadn't been there before. He went back to work eventually, needing money to live on, but he was different, distant, a man going through motions. His co-workers didn't know what to say to him, so they said nothing, and he worked in a bubble of silence, framing houses with mechanical precision, creating rooms for other people's children to grow up in. On the first anniversary of Mickey's disappearance, September 17, 1993, someone placed a bouquet of flowers at the base of the tree where the lunchbox had been found. No one knew who. The flowers were simple, grocery store carnations wrapped in cellophane, with a small card that said only Mickey. Robert and Christine drove to the site, found the flowers, stood there for an hour without speaking. The gesture felt both kind and cruel, an acknowledgement that people remembered, but also a reminder that remembering changed nothing. The flowers became an annual tradition. Each year on September 17th, someone, different people over the years, sometimes strangers who'd followed the case in the news, sometimes former classmates of Mickey's who'd grown up carrying the weight of his absence, would leave flowers at that tree. The ritual took on significance beyond the participants' intentions, becoming a form of collective mourning for a loss that belonged to the entire community. In the third year after Mickey's disappearance, Christine received an anonymous letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address, postmarked from Phoenix. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in shaky cursive that suggested either an elderly writer or someone whose hands trembled for other reasons. The letter read, "I see him sometimes in dreams. He is not afraid. He forgives you for not finding him. He wants you to know he made it to where he was going, just not the place you thought." Christine read it 3 times, trying to understand if it was meant to be comforting or cruel. The handwriting wasn't the same as the note in the lunchbox. The tone was different, but the knowledge of details, the implication that Mickey was dead, that his body hadn't been found, that his parents carried guilt, suggested the writer knew something, or was pretending to, or was disturbed in ways that made them believe they had insight into events they'd only read about. She showed the letter to police. They analyzed it, added it to the case file, tried to trace the Phoenix postmark to any specific location or suspect. But Phoenix was a city of millions, and the letter could have been dropped in any of thousands of mailboxes. The investigation went nowhere. More letters arrived over the years, from different writers, or perhaps the same writer disguising their handwriting differently each time. Some were spiritual, talking about heaven and angels and Mickey being in a better place. Others were disturbing, containing details about how a child might die, hypothetical scenarios that made Christine's skin crawl. Police tried to trace them all, managed to identify a few writers, lonely people, disturbed people, those who inserted themselves into tragedies for attention or from genuine delusion, but none led anywhere meaningful. The case gradually faded from public consciousness. News cycles moved on. Other tragedies demanded attention. Mickey's face, once omnipresent on flyers and newscasts, disappeared. The tip line was disconnected after 5 years. The detectives originally assigned to the case retired or transferred. New investigators inherited the file, looked through it periodically, found nothing new to pursue. The case was reclassified as cold, joining thousands of other unsolved disappearances, tragedies that had devoured families and communities before receding into bureaucratic limbo. Robert and Christine divorced in 1998, 6 years after Mickey disappeared. The split was quiet, inevitable, the result of two people who'd been hollowed out by the same trauma, but couldn't help each other heal. They'd spent years living in the same house, but existing in separate worlds of grief. Robert channeling his pain into obsessive action, Christine collapsing into paralytic depression. Neither blamed the other, but they couldn't be together anymore. The house on Cherry Avenue was sold. Christine moved to a small apartment across town. Robert left Flagstaff entirely, relocating to Nevada, taking a construction job in Las Vegas, where no one knew his story. The new family who bought the house didn't know its history initially. The real estate agent hadn't disclosed it, and the previous owners had been Harlow family members managing the estate, not Robert and Christine themselves. The new family moved in with young children, ages 4 and 7, excited about the yard and the neighborhood. They repainted Mickey's room, chose bright yellow to cover the pale blue walls, removed the dinosaur posters, replaced the carpet. Within 3 months, they learned what had happened there. A neighbor mentioned it casually, assumed they knew. The mother was horrified, felt like she'd been deceived, looked at her own children and imagined Christine's grief, felt it as a haunting. They considered moving but ultimately stayed, trying to convince themselves that houses weren't cursed, that tragedy didn't linger in walls and floorboards. But some tragedies do linger. The neighborhood never quite recovered its innocence. Parents who'd lived through Mickey's disappearance passed their anxiety to the next generation, warning their children with an intensity that seemed excessive to those who didn't know the history. The stories became garbled over time, the details shifting, the timeline compressing, Mickey's age changing in retellings, the circumstances growing more sinister or more mysterious depending on who was telling it. By the time children who'd been born after 1992 reached middle school, Mickey Harlow had become almost mythical, a cautionary tale about strangers and dangers and the world's fundamental untrustworthiness. Mrs. Chen, the crossing guard, worked for 3 more years after Mickey's disappearance before retiring. She never fully forgave herself for not remembering more clearly, for not being able to confirm definitively whether Mickey had crossed that intersection on September 17th. The uncertainty ate at her, manifesting as nightmares where children crossed her intersection and she couldn't see their faces, couldn't tell them apart, couldn't protect them. She died in 2003, age 83, having spent her final decade carrying a guilt that wasn't really hers, but felt nonetheless inescapable. Sergeant Delacroix retired in 1999 and died of a heart attack in 2004. He'd worked hundreds of cases in his career, but colleagues said Mickey Harlow was the one that had broken him, the one where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The jurisdictional conflicts, the media pressure, the false leads, the mistakes in evidence processing, the suspect they'd almost charged incorrectly. It had been a perfect storm of investigative failure, and he'd carried the weight of it until it literally stopped his heart. The detectives who'd worked the case over the years would occasionally gather, informal meetings at a bar or coffee shop, comparing notes, revisiting theories, wondering what they'd missed. Some believed Mickey had been taken by someone passing through Flagstaff, an opportunistic abduction by a predator who'd never been on their radar. Others thought it was someone local, someone who'd known the family or the school routine, who'd planned it carefully enough to avoid the mistakes that usually caught perpetrators. A few entertained darker possibilities that Mickey had wandered off himself, gotten lost in the vast wilderness around Flagstaff, and the backpack and lunchbox had been moved by animals or random hikers, that the note had been a cruel hoax by someone unrelated to the disappearance. None of the theories could be proven or eliminated. The case existed in a state of permanent uncertainty. Christine lived alone for the rest of her life, never remarrying, working administrative jobs that required minimal human interaction. She moved several times, always to smaller apartments, always to places where no one knew her story. She kept a box of Mickey's things, his pajamas, some of his Matchbox cars, the school photo from spring 1992, but she didn't display them. The box stayed in a closet, unopened for years at a time, a repository of a life that had been violently interrupted. She died in 2019, age 64, cause of death listed as heart failure, but understood by anyone who'd known her story as something closer to a very slow suicide, a body that had stopped wanting to continue. Robert remarried in 2005, a woman he met in Las Vegas who knew his history, but married him anyway, hoping love could heal what had been broken. They had a child together, a daughter, and Robert tried to be present for this new family, to not let the past contaminate the present. But his wife said he was never fully there, that some essential part of him had remained in Flagstaff, remained in 1992, remained in that forest looking for a small boy who'd never been found. They divorced in 2012. Robert continued living in Las Vegas, working construction, growing older, becoming more isolated. He died in 2021, age 68, in a workplace accident when scaffolding collapsed. His daughter, sorting through his belongings afterward, found a folder containing every newspaper article about Mickey, organized chronologically, annotated in the margins with questions that had never been answered. The case remains officially open. Somewhere in a police department archive, a file box labeled Harlow, Michael, Missing Person, 1992, sits on a shelf alongside hundreds of other cold cases. DNA technology has advanced significantly since 1992, and occasionally someone suggests running evidence through new databases, comparing against unidentified remains found in other jurisdictions. But there's no evidence to test. No body was ever found. The backpack and lunchbox yielded no usable DNA. The note had no genetic material. There's nothing physical to subject to modern analysis. Occasionally, someone comes forward claiming to be Mickey, claiming to have been abducted and raised under a different name, claiming to have escaped and want to reconnect with their biological family. These claims are investigated, DNA tests are run, and every single time the person is revealed to be someone else. Confused, delusional, or deliberately fraudulent, each false claim reopens wounds, forces surviving family members to hope and then grieve anew. The forest where the backpack and lunchbox were found looks no different now than it did in 1992. The trees have grown taller, the logging roads have been repaved, but the essential character of the place remains unchanged. Endless stands of ponderosa pines, the smell of sap and earth, the silence broken only by wind and birds, and the occasional hiker passing through. The tree where the annual flowers appear is marked now, not officially, but through collective knowledge. People leave other items sometimes, small toys, photos of their own children, prayers written on scraps of paper. The accumulation of these offerings has created an informal memorial, a place where strangers come to acknowledge a loss they didn't personally suffer, but somehow feel connected to. In Flagstaff, Mickey Harlow's name still carries weight. People in their 40s and 50s remember when it happened, remember the searches, remember the fear. Younger people know the story in outline, if not in detail. A kid who disappeared, never found, probably dead, definitely tragic. The case has been featured on television shows about unsolved mysteries, examined in podcasts about true crime, analysed in forums where amateur detectives propose theories and debate evidence. None of this attention has generated meaningful leads. The case resists solution, remaining opaque despite decades of scrutiny. The last person confirmed to have seen Mickey alive was never definitively identified. Mrs. Chen thought she'd seen him, Other parents thought they might have glimpsed him in the crowd leaving school. A clerk at the corner store said maybe a kid matching his description had come in that afternoon. Or maybe it was a different kid, or maybe a different day entirely. Memory is unreliable, especially memory of unremarkable moments that only became significant in retrospect. The truth is that Mickey dissolved into a crowd of children on a Thursday afternoon and simply never emerged. Between the school door and home, in a walk that should have taken 12 minutes through a safe neighborhood in daylight, he vanished. What happened to him remains unknown. The most likely scenario, according to criminal profilers and investigators, is that he was abducted by someone who either killed him quickly or kept him alive for a period before killing him, and that his remains were disposed of in a location that has never been searched or was searched inadequately. The forest is vast. Bodies can be buried, can be scattered by animals, can decompose into nothing in a matter of months under the right conditions. Or he could have been taken elsewhere entirely, transported out of state, killed and disposed of in a location so far from Flagstaff that no one ever thought to look there. The note suggests he's dead. He didn't feel any pain. But the note could be misdirection, could be the product of a disturbed mind, could mean anything or nothing. The cruelty of unsolved cases like Mickey Harlow's lies not in the absence of closure. Closure is a myth, a word people use to pretend that grief has an endpoint, but in the permanent state of ambiguity they create. Christine spent 27 years not knowing whether her son was alive or dead, whether he'd suffered or died quickly, whether his body was lying somewhere waiting to be found, or had been destroyed beyond recovery. That uncertainty was its own unique torture, preventing mourning from completing, preventing memory from settling into the past tense. Robert died without answers. So did most of the investigators. So eventually, will everyone who knew Mickey, everyone who searched for him, everyone who was touched by his disappearance. In time, when everyone who remembers Mickey personally has died, he'll become purely historical. A case file, a statistic about missing children in America in the 1990s. The emotional weight will dissipate. The tragedy will become abstract. Some researcher writing about unsolved crimes will include his name in a database, noting the date, the location, the age, the outcome, unknown, and move on to the next entry. His life will be reduced to data points, the specificity of who he was, a boy who liked dinosaurs and organized his toy cars by color, who ate his oatmeal slowly, who had freckles and a gap in his front teeth, erased by time's indifference to individual suffering. But for now, for the people still alive who remember, Mickey Harlow remains real, remains present in his absence. The empty space where he should be, graduating high school, going to college, getting married, having children of his own, growing old, is palpable. He would be 39 years old now, in 2025. He should be middle-aged, should have lived a full life, should have had the opportunity to become whoever he was going to become. Instead, he is forever 6 years old, forever frozen in a school photo with a gap-toothed smile, forever walking down Cherry Avenue in a blue windbreaker carrying a red lunchbox, forever disappearing around a corner into September 1992, into a mystery that has outlived almost everyone who tried to solve it. The flowers still appear, each September 17th, placed by unknown hands at the base of a ponderosa pine in a forest that keeps its secrets. They are a small gesture, meaningful primarily to those who leave them, a way of saying that someone remembers, that the forgetting hasn't been complete, that a 6-year-old boy who almost made it home still matters in whatever small way acts of remembrance can make anyone matter. The flowers wilt after a few days, decompose back into the forest floor, become indistinguishable from the endless cycle of growth and decay that characterizes the natural world. And each year, new flowers replace them, and the ritual continues, marking time, marking loss, marking the permanent wound that Mickey Harlow's disappearance carved into a community, a wound that never quite healed and perhaps never will.